Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Are we on? I'm Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm really pleased to welcome everybody here for this debate today on why should the United States care about Ukraine. Should we care about Ukraine, as I'm corrected from the stage already? So we're really incredibly excited to host this discussion, this debate, and in some respects, it's long overdue. And there are a lot of reasons that many of you I see in this audience have argued over the years about why we should or shouldn't care about Ukraine. And I'm confident that the outstanding panelists here will enumerate many of those arguments. But our hope is that this exercise today will be something that will be insightful, engaging, productive, and the first of many more. We have a good track record of seeing a good turnout when we host things in this kind of setting, and I'm proud that the Atlantic Council is able to partner with the national interest on this. We want the Council to be a platform for rigorous debate, dispassionate analysis on fleshing out differing views about how to honestly really tackle the tough, challenging issues that face us, that face our country. And I'm delighted that we're able to do this today in partnership with the national interest. This debate is clearly on the record. We're inviting all of those that are following online to join in social media using the hashtag #FutureUkraine. And I'm going to be quiet and turn this over to our two fantastic moderators to introduce the terrific lineup. And with that, I'll hand it over to Melinda Haring, who is our own Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center and a previous editor of Ukraine Alert, as well as Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor at the National Interest. Over to you. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you so much, Damon. Good afternoon. We're thrilled to finally have this debate. Jacob and I will be the traffic cops today. Thank you for joining us, and I'd like to thank our friends in Mariupol, Ukraine, who are joining us by video camera. Welcome to our students at Mariupol State University. Thank you to our partner, Elvidius, for organizing that. Now, we have a couple of ground rules for this debate. Our sides vigorously and sometimes violently disagree, but we will be respectful. We're going to have a real debate, and then you can jump in with questions.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce each side. To my left is Ambassador John Herbst, Director of the Eurasia Center and a former ambassador to Ukraine, who will argue that America does indeed have vital strategic interests in Ukraine. His debate partner is Dr. Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis. Welcome, John and Alina. George Beebe, to my right, is Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest, and he will argue au contraire that America does not, in fact, possess vital strategic interests in Ukraine, and that the common tropes about U.S. support for Ukraine are both off the mark and sometimes even bogus. His debate partner today is Dr. Will Ruger from the Koch Institute. Welcome, George and Will.
Thank you. Thank you.
So before we dive in, I want to say a few words about where this debate came from, because debates are way too uncommon in this town. Throughout the recent impeachment hearings, witness after witness claimed that support for Ukraine is obviously in U.S. national interest without explaining why. In response, the National Interest, to its great credit, published an article by George in which he compared U.S. policy toward Ukraine as groupthink that led to the disastrous policies in Vietnam. Now, John Herbst read the article and thought about it for a while, and then he responded finally in print, and he essentially said, wrong, 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 wrong. We have copies of both of these articles for you outside. In early January, we had a private lunch, and George and I debated this topic, and I challenged him to a public debate, and he was gracious enough, or foolish enough, to accept. We'll see. So let it begin.
I am now going to assume the role of traffic cop, so the green light is yours, George, for 3 minutes.
Great, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Melinda. Thank you, Damon. Thank you, John, for the invitation here. You've already proven to be very gracious hosts, so I'm already indebted to you for this invitation. I want to say here briefly something about my purpose here in this debate. I can't speak for Will, but I did not come here to win. And I realize that this is unusual for someone who has agreed to a debate. But I came here to explore the areas where we might all be able to agree and to understand why it is that we differ on the things that we disagree about. And that's not because I lack conviction. It's not because I don't have faith in our rhetorical abilities. It's because I believe that the desire to win, to defeat the other side, is exactly the problem that we are suffering from in Ukraine. Each side in this conflict has sought to win. Each believes that it can and must win. Moscow has faced off against Brussels and Washington over the kind of Europe we will have, what the rules are going to be that will govern this region, and whether and how Russia can play in it. Lviv and Kyiv and Donetsk have all struggled over what it means to be Ukrainian and whether Ukraine will join East or West. We have all fought over facts, over intentions, over what constitutes the common good and how to achieve it. And the result of this competition is, in my view, obvious. Everyone loses. Moscow loses, Brussels loses, Europe loses, the Donbass loses, Galicia loses, and most tragically of all, the Ukrainian people lose. And that's because no side can prevail in this war. So I commend the Atlantic Council for framing this discussion the way it has. Why should the United States care about Ukraine? Rather than the question, what should we do about Ukraine, which is where we usually start these discussions. And we really can't know what it is that we should do unless we start with that question of why we should care. And that question of why we should care is really a question about American national interests. What matters to US interests and what matters most? What should we care about more than other things when it comes to Ukraine? What is vital? What must we go to war to defend? And what interests can we protect through other means? And where can we and must we compromise? Now, I realize compromise is a dirty word in Washington, particularly since the end of the Cold War. We are not accustomed to a world in which we have to make hard choices, in which we have to sometimes settle for half-a-loaf outcomes. Now, Will and I think very similarly about what US national interests are regarding Ukraine and how to prioritize those. So to economize on our time and avoid redundancy, I'm going to defer to Will to address that more directly. But I will say on this issue that our most important interest in Ukraine, by far, is to avoid stumbling into direct military conflict between the United States and Russia. Other interests pale by comparison. Thank you.
George, it is now Alina's turn for the flashing green light for 3 minutes.
So thank you so much, Atlantic Council and National Interest for hosting this, but I'm not going to cut too much into my very brief 3 minutes with many things, except to say that I agree with George. I think we are here to find areas where we can agree on, but I think what we are here to discuss is the reality on the ground that is facing the people of Ukraine, and that is also killing the people of Ukraine, versus the intellectual theory of realism. With that in mind, why should the United States care about Ukraine? First, we have to remember our history. And our history of the 20th century basically tells us that what happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe. I don't have to point any further than the atrocities of World War II and World War I and the entire competition during the Cold War, which greatly affected US national security interests. Two, there's a general view out there that I will not ascribe to our opponents necessarily, that spheres of influence are stable, that they produce a stable international system where Russia has its own neighborhood to police, and we, far away in the United States, should let them take care of that business. But again, as we have seen, spheres of influence are the opposite of stable. Why? Because there are people that live in those spheres of influence, and those people have the right to determine their own future and their own trajectory. And they have the right to figure out which direction they want to head, whether it be towards liberal democracy or authoritarianism. And that exactly is why we had the fall of the Soviet Union. I lived in Ukraine, the Soviet Union. I can tell you that it was the desire of the people to not be in the Soviet sphere of influence, just like it continues to be the desire of Ukrainians to not be in the Russian sphere of influence. Fourth point, the reality is that we have a problem in the Kremlin. The desire to give Moscow an inch on Ukraine, to appease its desires to stop NATO enlargement, for example, doesn't mean that they will stop. Russia today, under this government, under the Putin regime, is a revisionist power. And giving it a little does not mean it will stop. And again, we have seen this historically over and over again. And very last point for our opening, containing and deterring Russia, which this administration has clearly said it wants to do because Russia is a great power competitor to the United States. It is an adversary to the United States. If we want to ensure that Russia does not meddle in our elections, does not interfere in other democracies of our allies, we have to stop it where it began. And the origin of that has been Ukraine and it has been Georgia. And that is why Ukraine matters for the United States.
Will, the floor is now yours for 3 minutes.
Great, thank you. So I'll start by just saying we should definitely care about Ukraine, okay? We should hope that Ukrainians will flourish as a people, that they will solve some of their economic problems, that they will overcome the challenges of corruption that hurt average Ukrainians. We should also wish for an end to the fighting in the East that has destroyed so many lives. And as a veteran myself, it was incredibly moving when I was in Kiev last year to see the photos of lost soldiers displayed on the sidewalk. It's an amazing scene. But the real question is, what should U.S. foreign policy look like towards Ukraine and the region in which it is located? And thus it is critical not to look at what is good for Ukraine based on our caring, but on what is good for the United States based on our national interests. This is because it is the supreme duty of our government to put American interests first and foremost. And we can't view our approach to Ukraine in a vacuum from our overall grand strategy. So we have to start at the strategic level, looking at strategic objectives. So first of all, U.S. foreign policy should be laser focused on the vital national interests of keeping the United States safe, securing the conditions of our economic prosperity, and protecting our liberal democratic system here at home. Those are our vital national interests. And in order to meet those objectives, we need to maintain a strong national defense. It could be second to none. We should reduce trade barriers with the world, including Ukraine, and use diplomacy to resolve conflicts with other states. But it also means staying out of conflicts and out of security commitments that aren't closely connected, directly aligned to those ends, and that could actually undermine our safety and our economic health. We've seen enough of that over the last 20 to 30 years. It also means being realistic about the interests of other great powers, especially nuclear powers, and finding ways to peacefully coexist consistent with our own interests. So what does that mean specifically for U.S. foreign policy towards Ukraine? First, it means finding ways to liberalize our trading relations with Ukraine. I'd perfectly be fine with unilaterally reducing barriers to trade with Ukraine. And that would be great for the Ukrainian economy and great for the United States. It's a positive sum game. But second, and perhaps more controversially, it means closing the NATO door, right? It means closing the door to NATO enlargement. We can get into more discussion later, but the safety of the United States doesn't depend on Ukraine, even as we are the well-wishers of the independence and freedom of Ukrainians. And keeping the door open actually makes it harder for us to improve our relations with Russia, the only existential threat to the United States in the region. It also isn't even clear that Ukrainians want to join NATO, as witness recent polling that was featured in the Washington Post, and it showed that only a plurality of Ukrainians support joining the alliance, 44%, and only 25% would want NATO troops or bases on their territory. Okay. Third, we need to impress upon the Ukrainians that since they live in a difficult neighborhood and Uncle Sam isn't riding to the rescue, that they need to find their own path in the region that reflects those realities. That could mean building an alternative security architecture to NATO in Eastern Europe, finding a pathway to peace with Russia. And we don't want to create moral hazard by leading them to think that we, the United States, are willing to do more than our interests and our public opinion will allow. Thank you.
Now it's John's turn to respond.
Okay. This is actually pretty simple. I agree with Will that American interests should predominate in our policy. And we have a great stake in what's called the liberal international order, because it's precisely the liberal international order which has guaranteed no great power conflict and extraordinary prosperity over the past, basically since the end of World War II, and even more since the end of the Cold War. And the Kremlin's objectives are quite simply to overturn that order. President Putin has said multiple times there'll be new rules or no rules for the international order. And those no rules include the war he conducted against Georgia and the war he's currently conducting in Ukraine. Now, we have no commitment to defend Ukraine, despite the Budapest Memorandum and all the unfortunate associations of the Budapest Memorandum. But we do have a commitment to defend the Baltic states. And if you want to make sure we don't have to defend the Baltic states with American forces, you make the Kremlin pay a heavy price in Donbass. And we can do that now. And we can do that in a realist stream without expending vast American resources. We have provided approximately $1.5 billion in military aid to Ukraine since Moscow's aggression began in 2014. That's peanuts, right? We haven't lost one soldier. We haven't had one drop of blood in this, because Ukraine has a vital interest in defeating Moscow and Donbass. So we provide military aid at a relatively modest level. I think we should do more. We should sanction Moscow as we have, because if it's an aggressive foreign policy, we don't want their economy to prosper. And we know that sanctions in the West have cost the Russian GDP anywhere from 1 to 1.5% of growth per year. So this is our great interest in Ukraine. And if you think that we have no problem in the Baltic states with Russia, keep in mind that when President Obama went there in September of 14 to reassure them, which was the dreadful word that we were using at that time as opposed to deterring Russia, that we had their back, what did they do? The Kremlin kidnapped a security official from Estonia 2 days after Obama left. Now, who had the stronger impact on security and a sense of stability in the Baltics at that time? So this is a serious game. Now, let me make another point which has not been made by our colleagues here, but it's made by those who represent a similar policy view. Although we had an echo here, which is that we have a great interest in not being in a shooting war with Moscow. Amen to that. But Moscow was a greater threat to our security 40 years ago when it was the Soviet Union. And we did not hesitate to stand up for American interests through other associates, even when the military balance of power was against us. And yet we stood them down. So you hear people saying, well, we can't help Ukraine with weapons or sanction Moscow because the Russians may go into the Baltic states. Right? We don't worry about that. We were willing to defend Berlin when it was far more vulnerable than Estonia, at the height of the Cold War, when Moscow was truly a danger in a way that Russia is not. Let's stop Putin's revisionism now, and let's stop it in Donbass. That's our interest.
Thank you, John.
Okay. Gentlemen, I've got a few questions for you. Will, let's talk about NATO.
Sure.
NATO membership isn't an issue. The U.S. hasn't talked about it seriously for 12 years. The commitment we've made to Ukraine is relatively trivial. It doesn't compare to the commitment we've made in Iraq or Afghanistan. And we're just basically talking about sanctions and some financial support. Why is this not in U.S. national interests?
Well, I'd want to be careful about saying that the United States hasn't talked about NATO enlargement, because 2 years ago, Vice President Pence, for example, went to Georgia and talked continuously about this, including talking about how, of course, the United States is committed to Georgia's sovereignty and is also committed to Georgia one day joining NATO. Similar things have been said about Ukraine as well. Now, of course, I understand that it's not imminent, but the fact is that we've seen organizations like NATO move down certain paths that eventually do lead to something as if it's a kind of fait accompli, right? We're already practically there at this point, so why not just formalize this? And I think that the United States needs to more carefully say, no, this door is closed, especially because there is the potential, like I said in my comments earlier, about moral hazard. How are we impacting, say, Georgia and Ukraine by even talking that way when we visit? By the NATO secretary talking about the eventuality of NATO enlargement. I don't think that's helpful. I think it would be better to really just kind of draw a line and say, look, we're not enlarging any further, because this will also stimulate things that are good for Ukraine and Georgia and other countries in that region, which is to develop an alternative security architecture. Mike O'Hanlon, for example, a few years ago wrote a great book talking about what this alternative might look like. And Mike O'Hanlon isn't exactly known as being like an isolationist or even a restrainer.
It hasn't been on the table since Bucharest. Yes, they may talk about it, but that's a rhetorical flourish. You were just in Kiev a year ago, and there's NATO flags everywhere. I think it's false to claim that this impulse is coming from the U.S. Ukrainians want membership. If you look at the polling, it's somewhere between 53% to 69%. It depends on which poll you look at.
Well, again, I actually brought my Washington Post article here that was in February 26. It says 44%, only 44% want to join NATO, and 25% would actually like to be closer to Russia. Now, again, I'm not trying to claim, that any single poll tells us the kind of the fullness of public opinion in Ukraine, but we also know that it's divided. And the fact is that this is the kind of Ukrainian opinion on joining NATO is honestly somewhat irrelevant to the question of whether the United States ought to allow a country to join us, because the fact is that NATO is essentially an American-led commitment where America is going to have to pay the most cost if NATO is actually engaged, as we've seen in other conflicts. And the fact is we need to be very certain about what we're getting into before we do this, because you think about the Baltics. The Baltics is a case where we basically acted before we thought very deeply. Okay, we thought that was going to be more of a free lunch than it could turn out to be. And now we're stuck with a really dangerous problem. I mean, it doesn't take an army general like I see in the audience to know that this is very difficult to defend if it comes to it. And the other point I would make here is that in relation to what John talked about is risk equals probability times consequence. So even if the probability of the kind of things we're talking about is really, really low, the consequence of a conflict with Russia is enormous. And therefore, the risk is enormous. And so we have to remember that, especially because, again, we won the Cold War with Ukraine, part of the Soviet Union. It spends $4.4 billion on its defense. We spend that in less than a week, right? This is just not a huge addition to a security alliance that just dwarfs Russia. I mean, heck, Europe alone could clearly counterbalance Russia and without even U.S. power, which is, of course, the largest power in the world.
Okay, I don't want to run down the clock fighting about numbers, but you still haven't answered my question. So why aren't sanctions and a little bit of financial support in U.S. national interests? Leave NATO aside. We can argue about that later.
Well, I think George mentioned it, that our most important interest in this region are better relations with Russia. Russia's the only existential threat. I don't agree with the national defense establishment in saying that Russia is a great power in the same way that they frame it. I think that was mostly rhetoric because we really wanted to focus on China. But the fact is that they still are a very important actor in the neighborhood. And we need to understand how we can move beyond some of the challenges that have been facing the Trump administration and even before. It's really critical that we get that on a better standing so that we can start to talk about arms control again, right? Things like that have been stymied by this.
Thanks.
Just a very quick comment on this. I think that a little bit of economic sanctions and support to the Ukrainians are absolutely justified. We ought to do it. The question is, what is our purpose behind this? What are we trying to use those tools to achieve? The goal is not to use tools. The goal is to reach an objective that is in the U.S. interests. So I'm absolutely in favor of using those tools, but I want to see them tied to an objective that matters and that is achievable. And right now I don't see that.
Hold on, but let's talk about that. Let's drill down. Isn't the vision one of Europe whole, free, and at peace?
No.
No. Go on.
No, because what we mean by that, and John and Alina, please weigh in on this, we tend to mean a NATO-centric Europe, whole and free, playing by rules that the United States and most of Europe has agreed to in the post-Cold War period. We don't mean Westphalia. We don't mean Helsinki 1975. We mean something more than that. And what we're offering to the Russians, what has been on offer, has been, you're welcome to be a part of this as long as you agree to those rules. And by the way, we get to decide when they're applied and when there are exceptions to those rules, not you. And the Russians have said, no, thank you. We will not be a part of that. We don't agree to that. And we don't agree that you get to decide what those rules are. Now, that's the situation. Now, when we say Europe whole and free, if that's what we mean, it will not be whole and it will not be free. Despite that intention, that's not an achievable objective right now. We need to look at a situation where we can manage differences. And there are stark differences between Russia and the United States, between Russia and vast parts of Europe on all of this. We can't wish those away. And we can't coerce the Russians into agreeing to that vision. That's the reality we're facing, and we've got to figure out how do we cope with that? How do we use the tools of statecraft, our leverage, our incentives, our sticks, to try to achieve an objective that is attainable, and it's going to be less than what we would have liked in 1992.
I'm going to let these guys clean up your comments in just a minute. I want to go to the heart of one of the hearts of your article, the argument of your article. You wrote that any approach to Ukraine rooted in the belief that the country as a whole can be pulled into the exclusive orbit of either the West or Russia will fail. And you rely on a bogus assessment of this old East-West cleavages within Ukraine. I would contend, and most Ukraine experts would contend, that Ukraine has massively changed since the Euromaidan 6 years ago, and there's a new sense of national identity that transcends the old regional identification. Don't Ukrainians or anyone else have a right to develop their own country and follow their own path? Where do those rights end, and why should Moscow get a veto?
Well, there's a difference between rights, which I fully agree with you on. The Ukrainians have every right to define their own national interests and to pursue them as they see those interests. There's a separate question to that, though, that has nothing to do with rights. It has to do with power. And unfortunately, Ukraine's rights and its power to realize those objectives are not in alignment. They aren't in alignment for the United States either. We don't have the power unilaterally to determine what Ukraine is going to be internally or what kind of external geopolitical orientation it will have. There was a period in the post-Cold War years where we did have that power. Russia may have objected to what we wanted to do, but Russia lacked the power to prevent it. That's no longer the case. The Russians, whether we like it or not, whether we think it's justifiable or right or correct or not, Russia has the power to prevent outcomes here. And if we don't acknowledge that, then we're going to be consistently disappointed in what life produces. We're going to be surprised by outcomes like what happened after the Euromaidan, which surprised people. It shouldn't have, but it did. And we're not going to be able to achieve the goals that we have because there's a gap between what we can do and what we aspire to do. That's not sustainable.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'd love to continue this string of interrogation, but we're going to give these guys a chance to rebut.
It actually will continue in the form of John and Alina have a total of 5 minutes for a cogent rebuttal.
So should I start? Do we split the time?
I thought you
It's
were
up to
interrogating us first.
Both of you.
No, you get to rebut them. Go ahead.
Okay. I'll start then.
Yours.
Well, first of all, I actually agree with some of the points you made, but let me lay a few things down on the table. On the NATO question first, NATO is the sole reason why we haven't had a great power war in Europe since World War II. It is the only reason. If we think about the alternative, meaning no, we had stopped NATO expansion, as some had suggested, away from the Baltic states, I guarantee that those Baltic states will have so-called frozen conflicts in them now. It would present a much greater security threat to Europe and, by definition, to the United States. NATO has been the only reason why we've had no war that has affected the United States in Europe to this day. Drawing lines has never led to long-term stability. And I would just go back to what you said, George. That is especially true when one of the actors, the Russians, have clearly said that there are no rules and they're not going to abide by any lines we draw. So if we draw a line, they'll just step right over it, as you, I think, rightfully said. And if Russia really didn't want NATO expansion, they would not have invaded Ukraine. There was very little support for joining NATO in Ukraine prior to 2014. It is thanks to Mr. Putin that we have such broad 44, 55, whatever the poll you look at, support for NATO membership in Ukraine. So it's really thanks to Russia's own strategy that we have that kind of consolidation around a national identity and also around NATO membership in Ukraine. And why do these countries want to join NATO? Because they have an aggressive Russia that will not stop no matter how much we give them. And I find it really concerning that we keep talking about the United States as this small, as if it's a small, tiny country that has no ability to affect global dynamics of power. The United States is the military power in the world. It is the economic power in the world. We have the ability to shape geopolitical power dynamics. And why are we demurring from a country like Russia, which is a country in decline economically, demographically, politically? They have their nuclear arsenal, and we're afraid of that, as if we don't have one, as if we can't deter them. And I don't know why you think so little of a U.S. ability to act as a global power in the world in a way that Russia cannot. As you also rightfully said, it is not a great power like the United States. Lastly, and then if we have time, I'll hand it over to John. We're not asking for a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, which is what the United States did, of course, after the end of the Second World War for Germany. Again, the figures you stated about Ukraine spending on defense of around $4.4 billion, and the United States has provided over the course of 5 years $1.5 billion. From the U.S. perspective, this is a great bang for our buck. If we don't want to be embroiled in another war, if we want Ukraine to be a democracy, because two democracies have never gone to war with each other, and because at the end of the day, this is not just about Ukraine, and it's not just about Europe, but at the end of the day, this is about a great competition between the democratic West and an authoritarian system that is challenging our freedom and individual rights. And it is about a contest for which countries come to the democratic side and which countries fall to the authoritarian side. I don't think anybody here wants to live in authoritarian Russia or authoritarian China. And every single country matters. So we no longer have the benefit or the ability to just say, oh, well, Ukraine's this country far away. If they fall into the Russian sphere of influence, not our problem, because it will become our problem. It may not be a problem in 5 years, but it'll be a problem in 10 years and 15 years. So I think that is the reality we live in. We're not in the 20th century, we're not in a Cold War. We have greater challenges, and every single ally matters, and Ukraine also matters for that reason. John?
John, it's 2 minutes.
It's 2 minutes? 1 minute, all right. I want to make sure that the audience understands the following. George said that the rules that Russia is opposing are rules that have emanated from the West, and I agree with that. But let's understand what those rules are. Let's not just talk about the Westphalian system or Helsinki. It boils down to a few principles. Principles that in fact were at Helsinki, but also in the Paris Charter, which Moscow signed in the early 90s. It says basically all countries have a right to being sovereign, making sovereign choices, to having their territory protected, having territorial integrity, and to resolving conflicts via negotiations and via international law, not by military aggression. These are the dreadful Western rules we're trying to oppose on Mr. Putin. I'm sorry. I think those are eminently reasonable. Now, you can believe that we should stand up for these rules and push back against Moscow's aggression in Ukraine and still say we can sit down with the Kremlin and talk about arms control. Pожалуйста, let's do it. But we will have a better chance of a successful arms control negotiations if we are stuffing them when they use aggression as part of their toolkit. And again, we were able to deter a much more powerful Soviet Union against the risk of a nuclear holocaust. Why in the world can't we do that with a punier Russia?
Now it's my turn to interrogate or question.
That's right, I like that verb.
John and Alina. And in listening to them, I felt a twinge of nostalgia for the Cold War, because I was Mr. Hawk during the 1980s and delighted in the fall of the Berlin Wall.
What happened?
You too can be redeemed.
And, well, redemption belongs to a religious category. But we're speaking in political terms. And after 1989, things did change. And I worry somewhat, or that both of you are vulnerable to the contention that you're trapped in a Cold War paradigm. I don't hear anything coming from either of you that addresses the new situation of the United States after 1989. And I'm asking because if you look at Ukraine today, and you look at the expansion of NATO, which George Kennan warned against repeatedly, and you can argue that Kennan was wrong, in fact, that the situation would be even worse today with Russia if we had not expanded NATO. However, his warnings can't simply be dismissed. The scenario that he painted did occur, which was that you do now have a revanchist and aggressive Russia. There's no question about that. An authoritarian regime that is seeking to maximize its influence abroad. However, it is not the Soviet Union. And what is in it for the United States to intensify its relationship with Ukraine, as it sounds like you're suggesting? You're talking about increasing sanctions. What's in it for America? What's the upside to going down this route when we've already incurred, if you listen to many realists, we've already incurred costs for proceeding down this path that we did not need to?
Okay. There are at least two answers to your question, or three. First, if you have a nostalgia for the Cold War, you don't really need to pay that much attention to Alina and me. Just follow the mainstream media in Moscow, in Russia. Because they've been on Cold War footing for certainly 20 years, if not longer. That's the first point. The second point, you suggested, I wouldn't say you made the point clearly, but you suggested that this current problem between Moscow and Washington is a result of NATO enlargement. But if you accept my point about the acceptable rules which Moscow has thrown away about sovereignty and territorial integrity, you'll know that Moscow began the policy of frozen conflicts. From the first moment that the Soviet Union died, the frozen conflicts as a conscious Kremlin policy was evident in Azerbaijan, in Moldova, in Georgia, and you saw intimations of it in Ukraine, vis-a-vis Crimea. And that was before people were even talking about NATO enlargement. So if there are any origins to this current problem, it starts with Kremlin policies that go back to the very best days of somewhat liberal, somewhat democratic Moscow under Yeltsin. Although I don't think it was Yeltsin's policies, it was the national security apparatus, from which, of course, Putin emerged. But then the third point, oh my goodness, the third point. I may need to pass off to you, Alina, because I'm forgetting the third point. I apologize to all of our audience on this. Of course. We have an interest. If you believe that we're in a great power competition, then we have to be concerned about the great powers, in this case, Russia. And isn't it to our advantage that NATO has expanded, that the very large Kremlin presence in Eastern Europe is gone, that Moscow, in fact, is even unable to control its own neighborhood? Aren't we keeping our great power rival, or our not so great power rival, off balance? As a realist, this makes perfect sense, and especially because this is cheap. This is not like our very expensive and quite unsuccessful misadventures in the Middle East. Very different. And it's based upon a careful reading, a realist reading of what's going on in Ukraine. Because the Ukrainians are going to fight for their independence and their sovereignty.
Do you have anything? So I'll follow up by saying another thing that occurred to me, one of the reasons I didn't articulate the NATO thing is because I'm not willing to stipulate that it's correct. I'm just throwing it out there.
You were nuanced, and my response, I hope, was nuanced.
What about the issue of Ukraine itself? What are actually the chances for the United States to influence this country positively? Your deputy director was quoted today, I did a little research this morning, in both
She's very able, be careful.
In both The Guardian and The Washington Post as announcing that a, quote, massacre, unquote, is taking place in Kiev right now. It seems like it's deja vu all over again. Politically.
Thank you.
I didn't say literal. What's the upside again for the United States for enmeshing itself in what are ultimately could be seen as parochial quarrels?
Who's the question to?
Either of you.
You want to take it?
I can start because I don't have a dog in this fight between Atlantic Council colleagues and the two of you apparently. I think the reality is that we're not inserting ourselves into parochial politics. What we're doing is that we're enabling the Ukrainians to defend themselves against an aggressive power. We're not inserting ourselves into Ukrainian elections or into Ukrainian politics at large. We're supporting the Ukrainians' ability militarily from a security perspective to stop the massacre that actually is happening in the Donbass. So that's point one. I think point two is that there is this narrative that is out there that Ukraine is the most corrupt country in the world, and why should the United States support it, because who knows what's happening to all our money. Corruption is a problem in Ukraine, that is no doubt, but if you look at Transparency International, over the course of time, things are getting better. Things are becoming more transparent. The Ukrainians are holding their governments accountable. I can tell you that every single president in Ukraine, including this one, is very, very careful about what they do because they don't want another democratic uprising. We've had two in Ukraine. Why have the Ukrainians fought? They fought against corruption first and foremost. And the government today understands that, and they're going to be very careful, I think, about making those decisions. So, and if we look at Russia and corruption, right? Things are much worse in Russia by exponential numbers if you look at Transparency International. Russia looks a lot like Angola or another country in Africa that is ruled by a dictator and autocrat because it is a country that has corruption at its core, and there is no weeding that out. There is the Russian system today. It's a system that is based on kleptocracy. That is not the system in Ukraine. Ukraine has the potential and the opportunity to be better, to be a better democracy. It is a democracy, but it has the ability to be better and to improve, but that can only happen with US support.
So I'll end with a quick question for John, which is, John, what is your game plan for Ukraine? We're at a stalemate right now. Mm-hmm. Putin does not appear to be intent on further annexation. What's your plan for extricating us out of this morass? Do you actually have a plausible scenario?
We're in no morass. The cost to us of our policy in Ukraine is very small. The cost to the Kremlin is large. They're losing 1 to 1.5% of GDP a year. And Mr. Putin has to hide his casualties because the Russian people don't want Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine. So the correlation of forces, to use an old Marxist term, is against the Kremlin. This is the war of the Kremlin against the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people want peace, but they also are not willing to surrender their sovereignty, which is what Putin wants. I think that our policy, in effect, mows along with Ukrainian policy. If they're willing to fight for their sovereignty and their territorial integrity, we support them. And at a certain point, Moscow is going to have to cut its losses. Putin's great designs for a Novorossiya in eastern Ukraine fell apart in the very first year of the war. Now he's playing just to keep a certain amount of instability. But Ukrainian economy is growing at a larger rate than the Russian economy, even despite the war. So this can go on for some time. And we're not fighting till the last Ukrainian soldier dies, but as long as Ukraine is willing to defend its territorial integrity, we should be with them.
Okay.
Thanks so much, John. Gentlemen, you have 5 minutes for a rebuttal.
Can I make a very quick
Sure.
point? And it's about the framing of this. Is this essentially an ideological battle? Authoritarian Russia against liberal democracy, led by the United States, led by Western Europeans, and who are allied to a liberalizing Ukrainian state? My answer to that is no. It's a distortion and oversimplification of the challenge that we're facing here, number one. And number two, the roots of Russian activity in Ukraine do not lie in the nature of the regime in Russia. This is something that is driven by international state dynamics. And what I mean by that is any state in Russia, regardless of the nature of its regime, would object to a potentially hostile military alliance on its borders. Boris Yeltsin, when he was president in Russia, very clearly indicated that Russia objected to NATO enlargement, particularly to places like Ukraine. This is a red line for Russians, regardless of who is in charge or the nature of that internal regime. And we have to recognize that. It's not ideologically driven.
So I would add, one of the big problems with our approach to Russia, and by its nature our approach to Ukraine, is that we're trying to pull a reverse Nixon, right? So Nixon and Kissinger were brilliant in splitting Russia and China together. So if we're really worried about great power competition, and when we mean that we're really worried about China, then you would want to find ways to put fissures between China and Russia. And instead, we're driving them together. We're provoking the security dilemma on the part of the Russians, and that is causing them to try to balance the United States. It's a common dynamic of international politics for thousands of years. So I think that we would be much better off if we could reassure Russia while still making sure that we are standing for kind of being well-wishers for Ukraine and not taking the other side simply because we don't want to push them away. But the fact is I think we need to have a different kind of approach there. The other thing I would say is, Alina, when you said to Europe and by definition of the US, I think that just encapsulates everything that is wrong with the primacist approach to grand strategy for the United States. Because it doesn't differentiate between the fact that different states have different interests based on their geography, based on their domestic system, based on a lot of different aspects of the nature of their political situation. And so when we talk about European countries, say, having an interest in Ukraine or Ukraine's interest vis-a-vis Russia, that's not automatically the United States's, right? We know that because we know, for example, that the Europeans balk at a lot of what the United States wants to do in the Middle East. They have different interests. They've defined their interests differently and they want to behave differently. The same could be said here. Think about our approach to the Ukraine and Russia. If Russia is such a huge threat to the West, why is it that European countries that are wealthy and populous are not balancing Russia to the same extent to which you would wish the United States to do so? Germany spends peanuts on its defense. Why? Part of it's because they're free riding, but part of it too is because they have different interests. So I would just go against this notion that by definition Europe and the US have the same interests. They don't. And then I guess finally I would say the size issue, Alina, is just not relevant here. The United States' interests are not dictated by its power. Our interests should be are dictated by these kind of fundamental, objective kind of ends of state, right? Reason of state. We shouldn't have, if we have a lot of power, it doesn't mean we have to use it automatically. Now, there's a problem when states have power, right, Chris Preble? There's a problem when states have power that they tend to use it. But the fact is that that's unwise. You should harness your power to meet the challenges and the threats of the world that actually strike at your interests. You shouldn't use power simply because you are a great power and can. And oftentimes, even when you do, it has second-order consequences that are destructive, ultimately, of your interests.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. It's now time to move to closing statements. You have 8 minutes, and I'm going to let you divide up the time as you see fit. So George and Will, the floor is yours again.
Okay. So I began today by saying that I believe that Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and the United States are engaged in a lose-lose struggle. And sadly, this is a situation where no one has yet recognized that there will be no winners in this contest. No one can defeat the other side, and the more that we all fight, the more we all lose. Now, to say this is not to be defeatist, you obviously fight the battles you have to fight, and you fight the battles that you can win. But the battles over Ukraine's geopolitical orientation are not battles that we have to fight, and not battles that we can win. Now, we can debate over whether Russia should have a veto over Ukraine's membership in NATO or the EU, for that matter. But the reality is that it does, and we can't change that. Now, we faced a similar problem to this at the end of World War II in Austria. Would Austria remain intact, or would it be divided between portions occupied by the US and its allies and portions occupied by the Soviet military? Would Austria join the East or the West? And we reached a compromise that helped everyone win to at least some degree, the 1955 Austrian State Treaty. And it accomplished several important objectives. First, and most important for US national interests, it avoided direct warfare between the United States and Soviet Union, both nuclear armed at that time. Second, it kept Austria intact, and it prevented it from becoming an arena of Cold War competition. Third, it prevented the consignment of Austria to the Soviet sphere of influence. And finally, it provided the geopolitical space for Austria to make its own decisions about its internal governance and its economic model. It allowed Austrians to prosper despite the broader Cold War competition that was raging outside their borders. The Austrian State Treaty was not a surrender. It was not Munich. It was not Yalta. It was not a cynical deal struck over the heads of the Austrian people. But it was not a clear win for the United States or for the Kremlin. None of us got everything that we wanted. But I would argue that a win-loss scenario in 1955 was not possible. And I submit that that is the situation that we face today in Ukraine. The sooner we recognize that reality, the sooner we can find a way forward so that we all stop losing.
Thank you very much. Will?
Yeah, I mean, again, I go back to where I started, which is to embed our conversation of Ukraine in our overarching conversation about grand strategy and U.S. foreign policy. And the very fact is that we have bigger fish to fry than the future of Ukraine. It's an important country to Ukraine, it's important to Russia, it's important to Eastern Europe, but it's of diminishing importance to us relative to the potential for an honest great power competition with China, as well as our domestic demands. I mean, in conversation in foreign policy, particularly in this town, we oftentimes forget about the fact is that there are trade-offs not just among foreign policy goals, but also with our domestic agenda, in terms of our attention, in terms of finances, in terms of kind of our ability to kind of follow through on the policies we intend to carry out. And I think that right now, in particular, you're seeing this around Afghanistan and the Middle East, where we have put so much energy, attention, manpower on that challenge that we have allowed a lot of the challenges here at home to be unmet. And that's why I think you've seen the rise of politicians like Donald Trump, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and despite the fact that Bernie Sanders didn't do too well, the fact is a lot of people in this country are unsatisfied with what's happening here at home. They have a real dissatisfaction with the establishment, and part of what the establishment has stood for is oftentimes prioritizing what is going on in other places relevant to the kind of challenges we face here at home. I mean, I just had to go by a bus stop in Farragut Square that talked about our national debt and deficit, something Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, said was our greatest national security threat. And yet we're paying almost no attention to that compared to the future of Ukraine, which again, very important to Ukraine. I hope it works out well, but not as important to America's future as our national debt and deficits, as well as issues with China and other aspects of our domestic politics.
We'll be very happy to have debates on those as well, Will.
Thanks very much for those forceful remarks from George and Will. And I can't resist noting that a footnote to George's remarks that Austria did become a democracy, but was and quite corrupt, and also became a socialist country. It may not have been all that.
Thank goodness for the Austrian banking system.
We now have a 8-minute closing statements from both John and Alina.
Thank you. Just to make it very clear, the reason why we have a multi-trillion-dollar deficit in the United States has very little to do with the $250 million that the United States gives annually to support Ukraine's military. It has a lot to do with the domestic issues and trade relations, but I think that's a story for another debate. I think great power competition has become a bit of a trope and a jargony term that nobody really knows what it means when we say it. And it could be almost replaced with black magic to explain everything. But I think in reality, what does it actually mean? It means that the United States and our allies have to contest at every turn and across multiple arenas across the world, Russian and Chinese influence and their desire to project power. And yes, our ability to project power is buttressed by our military ability and capacity. There is no question about that. If Russia was not a nuclear power, I doubt we'd be talking about it right now, because their ability to project power is also backed up by their ability in the military domain. So these two, soft power and hard power, are interlinked inevitably. So I think great power competition means that we have to take seriously incursions by Russia and China in places like Ukraine and in other places across the world if we want to maintain an international system that has produced the kind of relative peace and prosperity that most of us have experienced. I think it's very easy to take that for granted, and I think we have. I think the younger generations, the people that are even younger than me and Melinda here, have very much taken it for granted. We have seen a lot of questioning about democratic values and principles in multiple surveys in the West. But I think we have to understand that there is a reason why we live in a place where we can make our own decisions about our lives, where we can hold our governments accountable, and where we have enjoyed relative economic stability. And it is because the undergirding of that is what John has called the liberal international system, but what we can just basically call US leadership in the world and our alliance structure. In terms of reassuring Russia, so since 1991, we have tried to reassure Russia at least 4 times. We've had 4 resets with Russia since 1991. And every single time, those resets have failed. Why? I think if you go back and look at your history, it's been the invasion of Georgia, which, by the way, we had a reset less than a year after the Russians invaded Georgia. And then what did they do after that reset policy of the Obama administration? They annexed Crimea and invaded Ukraine. They violated the INF. They killed Boris Nemtsov. They poisoned journalists. They interfered in our elections. They poisoned a British citizen in the UK. You know, the list of atrocities can go on and on. I think we have to be realistic about who we're dealing with here, and that we have tried to reassure them, but it will never be enough. And the argument that appeasement is a policy that works for produced stability has been countered most and foremost. Again, I go back to World War II. I would say very lastly, defense spending, which is a point that I think we all agree on. Yes, Europe should defend its national security interests by investing more in its own ability to defend itself. I would be happy to see Europe much more engaged in Ukraine. I'd be happy to see Europe much more engaged in places like Syria that affect its national security. I think we can agree on that. But at the end of the day, we are better off if Europe is whole, free, and at peace. And that is the ultimate goal. If I have a second, I can't help myself but to talk about the Russia-China argument that Will laid out. 1 second. And I think that this is worth pointing to. There is a general narrative that I think Will spoke to, that a real problem in the long term is China. And that is true. That is true. On the whole, if we look at a variety of factors, China is a much greater threat to U.S. Leadership in the world and to U.S. Power projection across the world than Russia. But the idea that we can lure Russia away from China by giving various concessions like stopping NATO enlargement, stopping EU enlargement, et cetera, and that will somehow lure the Russians into the fold, and that will be our great policy against China, is a false argument. Why? Because every concession we make to the Russians benefits the Chinese interest, which is to chip away at that very international order that the kind of Russia rapprochement, a fifth reset, if you will, would lead to. And I'll stop there.
John.
Okay, very quickly. We have a vital interest in stability in Europe for our own security and prosperity. The problem here is that Kremlin is trying to undermine that. So that's why we need to stop them in Ukraine. So Ukraine is not some peripheral issue. Buttressing Alina's point, if we appease Moscow, we are not going to make it easier for us to work against China. Kissinger's masterstroke of the outreach to China did not come at the expense of our defense of Taiwan. And essentially the argument you're proposing is give Russia Ukraine in order to get Russia to cooperate with against China. No, it's based on hard power that we reached out to China against Russia in the early 70s. Austria. The Austrian Treaty was a result of 8 years of negotiations and 400 meetings. It was not the main issue on the table. We were able to agree to the neutrality of Austria because Moscow had agreed to Germany joining NATO and, in fact, to Germany's rearmament. That was the big game. We have an interest now, again, Ukraine is not Austria because Ukraine is the focus of Kremlin aggression, not a secondary issue. If Ukraine, and keep in mind, again, this is not about NATO enlargement. Moscow's aggression in Ukraine was prompted by a trade agreement between Ukraine and the EU. That's where this comes from. So again, NATO is not the issue. The issue is Moscow's desire to control what's going on in Ukraine, which has a domestic as well as a foreign policy component. If Moscow is willing to say, hands off the Baltics, we just want Ukraine, that would be interesting for realists in the United States. And in fact, one Russian commentator, Dmitry Trenin, suggested that after Trump won in 2016. But of course, there's been no statement by Moscow that they have no interest in the Baltics. They continue provocations there. You want to defend our NATO allies, stop Putin in Ukraine. And that is a great American interest, even vital. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, George, Alina, and Will. Please put your hands together and help me thank our outstanding debaters. Okay, now it's your turn to participate. Please raise your hand. Hold on, not yet, not yet. Identify yourself and ask a question. And we have a policy here at the Atlantic Council. I know that everyone here passed high school, but a question has a question mark, not a period. Please don't make grand statements or pronouncements. I will cut you off, and we would welcome questions from our crowd in Mariupol as well. So first question, if I could have a microphone for the gentleman in the red tie, please.
Hi, I'm from Ukrainian embassy, and of course my question will go to George and Will. So I'll try to avoid long statements as much as I can, obviously.
Just pointed questions, please, because
yeah,
lots of people want to ask
there'll be a
questions.
short question here. So how long do you think will all the territories of so-called post-Soviet region hold should Ukraine fall? And sort of little add to that, do you think that there would have been a case of Venezuela and Maduro should United States of America was more proactive in Georgia and Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlemen?
I don't think Ukraine is going to fall. I don't think the United States will allow that, nor should we allow that. On the other hand, I don't think that we are going to be able to bring Ukraine, as Melinda quoted from my article, intact into the Western embrace. And by that I mean either the EU or NATO. So what I think is likely in Ukraine, unless we can find a compromise there, is that this war, this conflict will go on for a long, long time indecisively. Now, who loses from that? The worst sufferers from a situation like that are in Ukraine itself. But I would also argue that American interests suffer, Russian interests suffer, European interests suffer. What are we going to do about that? That's the question that I think we have to focus on. And there are not easy answers to that. There's no way forward here where we get everything that we would like. That's also true for Russia, which I would say has badly botched its dealings with Ukraine. Leaving aside moral guilt, they've made strategic errors in the way they've handled this. So, would we have a problem in Venezuela? And by that I infer that you mean, would the Russians be as active in Venezuela as they are, absent what's going on in the former Soviet Union, in Georgia, Ukraine, et cetera? And my answer to that is probably not. I think that Russia is as active as it is in Venezuela to send the United States a strategic message. We can do in your neighborhood what we think you're doing in ours. How do you like that? And does that make you rethink what you're doing? That's an oversimplification, but I think it's a fairly good encapsulation of the fundamental strategic motivation that's going on there. There are other motivations, economic, that sort of thing. But fundamentally, they're sending us a message. And it's a message that they probably wouldn't feel compelled to send under different circumstances.
Okay, I don't want to be accused of being unfair. If someone's here is from the Russian embassy, we'll take a question from them as well. Do we have someone from the Russian embassy? No? No? Okay. We'll take a question right here.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. This is the same Russia that's killing thousands of patients and school children in Syria, the same one that's hacking our elections, and the same one that is creating a 24-hour-a-day nuclear roving torpedo. Aren't you guys making just an immense mistake stovepiping this Ukraine issue rather than coming up with a comprehensive Russia outlook?
I mean, I don't think we're stovepiping at all. We're saying we have to expand this to include lots of different issues. And I think that we should find ways, again, to be able to both potentially work with Russia when it comes to counterterrorism or some of the challenges in the Middle East, and also, be able to push back when it's necessary without it being bogged down about this question. I think that no one who says that we don't want to expand NATO or we shouldn't be involved in some of these conflicts thinks that Russia is a wonderful country, right? Or that Putin's regime is anything close to approximating the ideal that we have. And I think that's a common mischaracterization of the views that we hold, is that somehow it's pro-Russia. No, it's not pro-Russia or pro-Ukraine, it's pro-America. It's what is in America's national interest. And then one thing, since you brought up Syria, it's interesting that advocates of the liberal international order very infrequently talk about all of the ways in which the liberal international order has been neither liberal nor international nor ordered. And that includes many of these cases. So I think, again, I'm a realist, so I'm never surprised that these norms are broken and that power and interests matter more than these kind of trophies. But nonetheless, I think it's important to kind of put that out there that that the United States is asking frequently for something that it itself is not willing to give.
Thanks a lot, Will. Vlad Rashkovan in the front, please.
Thanks. Vlad Rashkovan, IMF. First, it's a very interesting feeling to be here, and it's like on the court hearings about yourself. But I think the question is of the debate is pretty good. But I would rephrase it: not what U.S. should take care about Ukraine. Should Ukraine take care about U.S.? Because Ukraine fighting in Ukraine not only for Ukraine. We're fighting with totalitarian country, because we're a democratic country. Ukraine is the European country, is a liberal country, and fighting with, again, totalitarianism. And so, should Ukraine fight or support U.S. in Europe? Would it be in the interest of U.S. To have 40 million people more totalitarian, less liberal, more militarist, closer to your, also your friends and your allies' borders?
I mean, I'm happy to take. I mean, the United States has an insecurity complex, right? It believes it is not as safe as it actually is, and that's a big problem, right? So I don't wake up in the morning and say, man, we need those 44 million Ukrainians because it's going to be on next week, next month, or next year. I look at it and say, we have a robust nuclear deterrent that means that other state actors attacking the United States homeland with anything but a nuclear exchange is basically impossible. I look at it and say, we have the world's strongest Navy, the world's strongest Air Force, the world's second strongest Air Force in the Navy's Air Force, right? We have so much conventional power that we can deter and defend. Geography still matters. The balance of power in Eurasia is very robust, right? We talk about Russia, it's relatively weak, and yet at the same time it's this massive threat. I don't get that contradiction. But the fact is that Western Europe is really strong. They're wealthy. They could buy more military power, and even the military power they do buy would be enough to prevent Russia from doing what we worried about in the Cold War, which was, charging through the Fulda Gap and making it to the Dover Straits, right? That's just not reality-based. And that's why I think that Jacob's question earlier about Cold War thinking is relevant here. The world is just very different. Russia has the economy of Spain, and no one thinks about Spain being economic dynamite. Russia doesn't have vast military power and power projection capabilities. We've already talked about that. Remember when they were sailing that naval ship into the Mediterranean? It was like a joke, right? And again, the problem I think is that the people who share some of the views of our debate partners, they want to have two things in their head at the same time. Russia's really weak, so we could push them around, and they're really a threat. I don't think those two really mesh well together.
That, because I'd be happy to explain that to you, Will.
I look forward to it.
How Russia can actually be a declining power in economics, and demographics, or sort of its political alliances, yet at the time have great power ambition and the risk tolerance under this regime to act on those ambitions. And what we've learned over and over again, especially in Syria, since that was brought up, where Russia has had a decisive role in shifting that conflict away from where the US said it wanted it to go and in favor of Bashar al-Assad. And now, as we're watching it play out, potentially now causing yet another wave of refugees, which is a huge national security threat to Europe, because it has been able to seek out points of opportunity where the US disengages and leaves power vacuums. The Russians have very savvily stepped in with very little, because they are resource strapped and they are resource constrained. Yet that hasn't stopped them from hacking the DNC in the Clinton campaign, launching a giant disinformation attack against the United States, continuing to launch these kinds of influence operations in the United States, barrel bombing civilians in Syria in support of Bashar al-Assad, undermining our relationship with Turkey. I mean, they're active in Africa with mercenary groups and disinformation campaigns. They're active in Venezuela. Russia is acting like a global power. But why? Is because we've given it the space to act.
George, please.
Very quick comment on this. I think when we discuss Russia, its power, its capabilities, we tend to be in widely separate camps. Russia is a declining power. It can't really do much. We don't really have to worry about it. Or Russia is this offensive power with great ambitions, poses threats of aggression to its neighbors and to the United States. The paradox of Russia is that it is both of those things simultaneously. It simultaneously has offensive ambitions. It conceives of itself as a great power. It believes that all great powers radiate power into their immediate neighborhood, that they have influence over their neighbors. They can veto things that they believe threaten their security. It also thinks of itself as playing defense, that it's contending with the United States, which itself is expanding, pushing the boundaries of NATO ever closer to Russian borders. And both of these realities are not inaccurate. They coexist simultaneously. It makes dealing with Russia particularly difficult. We have to contend with both Russia feeling defensive and weak and Russia feeling aggressive and strong, because it's both of those things. It poses a real challenge for us.
That's a great point. Okay, does anyone have a question for these guys? They need some attention too. No? Yes. Okay, this gentleman right here, please.
I have a question.
Hold on, please wait for the, no, hold on one second.
Well,
Wait for the microphone, please.
all right, in your closing statement,
Could you please
pointed
tell
out-
us your name?
name is Orest, last name is Yachuk.
Thank you.
In your closing statement, you raised the example of Austria. And the implication of your statement was that, hey, this might be a wonderful solution for Ukraine. I view that as naive. So could you explain under what circumstance do you believe Putin would agree to that? To have Ukraine follow the Austrian example?
Okay, great, thank you.
I raised the Austrian example not because I believe it's a template that we can follow today and simply transplant to Ukraine. Ukraine obviously has important different characteristics than the situation we faced in Austria in the 1950s. I raise it because it is an example of finding a half-a-loaf solution, not a perfect solution, but one that protected our core interests, that didn't allow worst-case scenarios to occur. That's, in principle, I think, the spirit in which we need to approach the Ukraine situation today. Now, what would cause Putin to settle for half a loaf in Ukraine? Reality. He cannot achieve what I believe Russia would ideally like to achieve in Ukraine. It cannot bring Ukraine into Russia's orbit intact. It is beyond Russia's capabilities. Russia cannot conquer Ukraine militarily. It cannot hold territory that it actually were to occupy militarily over the long term. That's a losing battle. I believe Putin knows that. His hesitation in recognizing the sovereignty and independence of the People's Republic, so-called, in the Donbass, is an indication of his wariness of taking on too much in Ukraine. So I think reality is such that he realizes he's going to have to settle for dominating and controlling all of Ukraine. Now, we too, I think, have to recognize there are limits to what we can realistically aspire to in Ukraine too. Now, where does that leave you? It leaves you trying to find a half-a-loaf way forward. Now, what could that mean? It could mean saying, guess what? Donbass, Ukraine can't control it. If it wants to orient itself to the West, if it wants to build a liberal democracy, it can't do that and keep Donbass under its control at the same time. Or it might say, we're going to have to find other kinds of concessions that we're going to make. We're going to, for example, say Crimea, we're not going to try to recover it. Wrong, it was a victim of Russian aggression, shouldn't have happened, but the power reality is that we cannot bring it back. We're going to let that go, and the price for letting it go is Donbass stays a part of Ukraine and Russia leaves. Now, those are only a few of the examples that I could offer you as potential half-a-loaf ways forward here, but we don't face easy choices. We face difficult choices, things where there are options between horrible and terrible, poor and maybe a little better than poor. But that's the reality we're facing.
Thanks a lot. John, did you want to jump in?
I would simply say the following. Anyone who follows diplomatic relations between the United States and Russia knows that there's a problem of the Westerners, in this case the United States, negotiating with themselves. And this is why I, as a general proposition, react negatively to whether it's the Austrian proposal or the proposal of trading off Crimea for Donbass or Ukrainian sovereignty, because this is all a matter of Westerners talking to themselves about what Russia might do. What we need to make sure this comes out right is to make it as painful as possible for Moscow to continue this aggression. At that point, they might be willing to talk in a serious way. We know that the Minsk negotiations have produced zip, nada. We also know that there have been some serious conversations, 6 months at a shot, first between Tory Nuland and Surkov, and then between Kurt Volker and Surkov, and the Russians then shut that down. Only by demonstrating to Putin that he has no out do you get to the situation where maybe the Russians will talk seriously about a reasonable compromise. But I think it's a serious mistake for us to be producing compromise proposals while the Kremlin sits on its hands.
So
Make them sweat.
So, John, could I just ask you a question? It's an honest one. I'd love to hear what you think. What do you think the trade-offs are? Because I know you're too smart to think that there aren't trade-offs from this very aggressive approach, right? It's not just that we push them in the face and they just lie down, right?
I think it's imprudent to talk now about trade-offs. I think that's a serious mistake.
It's never imprudent to talk about trade-offs. That's the fundamental nature of policy discussions.
No, because again, you're not paying attention to what I just said, which is that Moscow's often used diplomatic ploy is to sit there and say niet, 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 and force you to continue offering things in concessions. And I'm saying that's exactly the wrong way to approach this.
John, I think we've reached a point of agreement. I agree with you. From a negotiating point of view, you don't start out by offering a concession. I agree. To reach a deal here, there has to be an element of pressure. There has to be, coming from the United States and Europe. But we also have to do that with a negotiating endpoint in mind that is realistic. That's my point. Right now, I don't see it. If we think that coercion by itself will cause the Russians to pack up and go home, and we can simply get everything we want, we're wrong.
Well, I don't know if what you've just said is right or wrong. I'm not disagreeing, but I'm not sure. I do know this. I do know that, again, the sanctions are costing the Russian economy. I do know that the Ukrainian economy, despite the fact that they are in a serious war, is growing at a faster rate than the Russian economy. I do know that the Russians are now in a period of zastoy, stagnation, like in the Brezhnev era. I do know that the Russian people have said multiple times in Levada polls, right, Russian polls, that they think they're in isolation. That's not a good thing. They don't like the fact that even Crimea is costing them money. And we know that Putin's ratings, while they're still in the high 60s, if you believe them, other ratings like, is Russia heading in the right direction, show that a majority of Russians think not. All these things suggest to me that I'm not predicting this, and George, as a former Intel guy, you'll appreciate this. I'm not predicting. We don't know what the future leads. But we do know there's a pattern in Russian history when unsuccessful wars lead to domestic changes. And I would not rule that out in this circumstance.
Okay, great. Let's bring our audience back in. Viola Ginger, right here, please.
Viola Ginger from Just Security. I have a question for Will and George. You have a rather, what seems to be somewhat narrow pre-globalization definition of U.S. interests, U.S. national security interests. Where would you draw the line, if any, with Russia? How far are you willing to let them go? And where are American values in this? I don't think the Ukrainians care about whether we care about them rhetorically. They care about actions from their ostensible friends and allies. So where would you draw that line, and where are American values in your definition of U.S. national interests?
Thank you.
Well, Will, you want to?
I mean, I just think it's interesting, just the way you frame that up. And it's not a criticism, but it is reflective of a kind of worldview, which is, you said, where should we let them? As if the United States should tell every country in the world what they can and cannot do. I don't think that's a productive way to engage in foreign policy making. You did say, where should we let them go? Okay, but the thing is that I think that is a reasonable argument to say that we've made commitments to the current NATO members, and therefore that is a line we should hold fast to, barring changes to the nature of the alliance. So I think that's a line if you're asking for one. As on the issue of values, I think we should promote our values widely. I just don't think that we should promote our values at the expense of our vital security interests. And I think those are distinguishable. I do not think that they are coterminous. And we have to understand that there are trade-offs there. Back to trade-offs. There are always trade-offs. So when we promote our values in Helmand, it creates challenges for our security efforts in that country. When we talk about values in the nature of Eastern Europe, it can cause some trade-offs there as well. So again, the military is not a very effective way to promote values. Okay, I don't necessarily think that expanding NATO is going to solidify our values per se, relative to other ways we can engage and promote those values through diplomacy and economic engagement.
Very quick comment. I don't at all believe that the United States should not promote its values. Oftentimes those that raise this issue, though, have an implicit assumption behind that, which is that we know what the most effective means is for promoting those values. We know what works in advancing our values in the world. And I would submit we don't. We've run into continuous surprises in trying to promote reforms. You recall the Washington Consensus in the 1990s about what sets of policies would lead to the creation of liberal market democracies around the world in the former Soviet Union. And we were continually surprised by our lack of success in doing all that. And I think this underscores how difficult it is to know what works in promoting our values. So I think we need to be thinking a little more humbly about how we do this and a little more creatively about what might actually work in promoting our values in the world.
I'm afraid that we have to terminate the questions. I should say that Melinda has constructed an intricate setup for today, which I've tried to execute as faithfully as possible. So don't blame me for us finishing actually on time. I must confess that in the beginning I was a little concerned because people kept using the word agreement and agree. That's the last thing you want as a moderator. You want disputation. I think we had plenty of disputes today, so please join me in thanking our panelists.